Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And I have a great astrologer on today from our northern neighbor, Canada. Her name is Lesley Francis. LesleyFrancis.com is her website. And we're going to be talking today about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming up in 2020. It's going to be a rather austere and sort of looks like a little bit of a foreboding kind of a alignment. But then again, we can always find the silver lining in this cloud. So we're going to try to do that. Before I get started, I want to remind you about my weekly newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll see a couple of paragraphs about the mundane shape of the planet for the week to come, which encompasses and involves all of us. And then I break it out into individual signs. I always encourage everyone who reads the horoscopes each week to read their sun sign as well as their rising sign. If you don't know your rising sign, contact an astrologer. They'll run your chart. It's based on your birth time, so it's important to remember that. And once you get that, you should be good to go. And it's really fascinating. The more information you have, the more exciting it is. You know, we live in a very vibrant world. The world is spinning around. There's so much activity. Our lives are chock-a-block full of all kinds of data and stimulation. But when we look at the astrology of the world, we can see some fascinating things beginning to unfold. So it's great to have another person to talk about it with. You know, astrology has its own language. And so when an astrologer meets another astrologer, watch out. We love to talk about what's going on, and we can always glean information from each other as well as enlighten you who listen. So it's important for you to understand astrology and learn to come to understand what value it has. It really is an age-old, time-tested practice that works just wonderfully. So my guest today is Lesley Francis. She's calling in from Alberta, Canada. So welcome to the show today, Lesley. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So we were chatting a little bit before the show about what's coming up in the world, and we see this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Anybody who has a fair understanding of astrology would say, ooh, Saturn and Pluto, my gosh, that sounds like a tough pair to deal with. And it could very well be. I don't necessarily think of Saturn as being an enemy. In many ways, I think of Saturn as being your friend because it makes sure that you get those bills in on time and you lock the house up at night and you're responsible and you get your homework done. So I don't think of Saturn as necessarily a bad planet, although it does get a bad rap. It just forces us to grow up. And I think that when it comes in conjunction with Pluto, Pluto may say you're going to grow up in a new way. And that's part of progress, isn't it? How do you feel about it?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, when we're discussing the difference between how things apply in an individual's life versus how they tend to impact, the broader society or the larger world, we recognize that it's easier for the individual to take that energy and take charge of it than it is in a societal way because it's unlikely that everybody's going to get together and go, let's use this energy for transformation in a positive and productive way. I really do think that when we see that, in many respects, certain chickens are going to come home to roost. Is it easy necessarily at this point in time to figure out what those chickens are or how they're going to come home to roost? So we are in a bit of a period of preparations. Saturn is currently in Sagittarius, perhaps the happiest place for it to be, but there is, in my mind, a loosening of hardline thinking and belief systems that can prepare Saturn for its new journey through Capricorn, the sign that it is in charge of, that it's the boss of, so that when it gets to that conjunction with Pluto, that doesn't mean that all things are going to be rosy, but if we are in a period of preparation, and in many respects we are, because there's a lot of energy going around the planet where people are asking others, well, what are your principles? What are your ethics? Which is very Sagittarius.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of a platform foundation, which is Saturn, are you standing on? Do you have a solid grounding? And because for me, Saturn is often about, and it's a different way of saying what you said, but it's the same thing, which is, are you practical? Are you accountable? Do you understand what the consequence might be?
Right.
And so we're living in a world where, Sag can often encourage us to freedom at all costs.
Mm.
And I think that sometimes, it's interesting because in your country, there is right now a lot of discussion about freedom of speech, about your freedom to believe what you believe, and to be aware that your beliefs and your attitudes have consequences to not just you, but the people around you.
Yeah, I think that's very valid. And I think getting back to the idea of Saturn, it is, I think, doing diligence, doing the right thing, being responsible, being pragmatic, all of which shine very nicely as it moves through Capricorn. I think that's going to be a good thing. I actually think it's going to be a cleansing period of sorts that allows us to sort of wipe away some of the, this accumulated dust that we have in our collective lives and sort of wipe the slate clean in a very responsible way. I think of Pluto as a way of sort of, it's the phoenix rising from the ashes. This is a chance to recover, renew. There's a lot of those, RE words I think that I apply when I think of Pluto. And I think that Saturn being there at the same time is going to enliven us and invigorate us. And I think we're going to find ourselves, wow, that was a tough row to hoe, but we sure got through it okay. And aren't we better off now that we did it? So it's sort of that, I think. It's not always fun, perhaps. But it will certainly be interesting. I think it'll be a time for us to sort of reset the clocks, per se, some way.
Well, but there's a lot of internal satisfaction that comes from building something that you believe is of lasting value. And I think that, some part of the challenge we face as humans is to recognize that life isn't necessarily always meant to be a walk in the park, with the sun shining and the birds tweeting, that growth comes. I don't mean that we have to suffer. I don't necessarily mean that, because that's often where people go when you start talking about the more challenging Saturnian aspects of life. But hard work is very satisfying, and taking your hard work and applying it in a way that creates a brand new, fresh, as you said, foundation, a breathing new life. Because of course, sometimes we don't think about, Saturn and Capricorn, and of course it will differ in everybody's chart as to where that falls. But it can be a new beginning, and a new cycle of accomplishment, new plans, new priorities. Saturn transits are often about new priorities. A cycle coming to a close and beginning a new cycle. Mm-hmm. No matter where it happens to be in your chart, or in the sky, and how it's affecting the rest of the world. Like, just bring in a little bit of information about that eclipse that's coming up in August. Well, it when you look at that eclipse, it's pretty intense, and of course, there have been many American astrologers talking about it, because it's the first time an eclipse has crossed North America for quite some time. But Saturn is at that point in time trying that eclipse, or close to trying that eclipse. And so what do I mean by that? They have a positive, easy relationship. So there could be a release or of some kind that brings renewed optimism. You don't always know, and I haven't looked at the entire chart for the eclipse, so I can't say. But just thinking about taking that fire energy and creating new enthusiasm and getting ready for. We always think tough times are bad, but that's where character is built.
It's certainly, I was just going to say that character is what is built out of hard times. And it is, I think nothing worth having ever comes easily. And I think that life is difficult by nature. I think that we have, either through means of Hollywood or social media or something, have sort of painted this picture that life is supposed to be rosy, and it isn't. I think it is always fraught with challenges and difficulty, which I think is part of the great ebb and flow of life. It's part of the yin and yang. It doesn't rain without the sun. We've got to have these polarities in order to seek the balance that we have in our lives. And we are dualistic individuals, and we swing from one extreme to the other and then everything in between. And I think that's just part of it. I think it's just the nature of life. I think the sooner we accept that as a en masse, the easier it is for us to move forward. I read a book many years ago, and maybe some people are familiar with it, The Road Less Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. And the very first sentence...
I love that book.
Yeah, the very first sentence in that book is, life is difficult, period. And that's the thing we've got to work from. Everything else is gravy. We have good times, of course, but we can't assume that we're supposed to have hunky-dory, rosy, walk in the park every day. I think you're right about that.
Well, and I do think that we get caught in these dualities and live at the extremes instead of recognizing, yes, because things are challenging does not mean that you cannot have joy in your life every day, that somehow if you're facing challenging times, you have to bite down really hard and grit your teeth and just suffer, right? It's like, it's funny, just a personal story. My dad once said to me, I think you've had a very difficult life. And of course, my first response was to be really pissed off because I thought, but you're not looking at what I did with it. Because really, that's the proof in the pudding.
It is.
And so when we're looking at transits, the key is always to ask ourselves, because we often, each of us individually, we have to process these energies in our own consciousness and then move outwards from that. We spend too much of our time either swinging from one extreme, which is everything that happens outside me is of the most importance, and I must keep my eye focused on that all the time, to then the people who just have all their energy focused inward. And again, it's that balance. So in order to prepare for these challenging times, not knowing what's going to happen, the easiest thing to do is to, and this is where seeking an astrologer and having a chart read and understanding where these things are playing out in your life allows you then to do what Saturn does best, which is to build the appropriate structure or foundation in order for you to weather the storm.
Yeah, and it keeps us honest. It keeps us on track. It allows us to fulfill our destiny, I believe is a good word for that. I think as part of, if we look at an astrology chart for an individual, we can see where the Saturn is. We can see where perhaps the difficulty is. But that difficulty, when I was young, I was extremely shy. I would never talk. I used to hide behind my mother and my father when I was very young. And it wasn't until I had gone through many different things, many different, life challenges, that I came to realize that I was able to master that. And I heard the same story about Winston Churchill, who went on to become a great orator. So these difficulties that come in your life are there, I think, to push us to this next level, which allows us to step into who we really are. But we've got to go through that walk. And I think, nothing worth having comes easily is a very good appropriate word and description for what Saturn does in our lives. And I think that looking forward to this conjunction that we're talking about coming up, I do believe that where we are now is sort of a dropping a needle on a record, and it's recording and making a sound of what this sound is. And this sound is very cacophonous right now. There's a lot of, fake news and everything else. It's a very blaring noise that we're hearing, metaphorically speaking. And I think that what will happen is this is going to allow us to tune that out, and not tune it out necessarily, but at least reshape it so that it's more melodious. I think that's what the challenge is. So the hardship we're feeling perhaps in this great thing may be setting us up for that shift in our focus and our thought process.
Well, and what can the individual do. I mean, we do have such a tendency as humans to awfulize things, right?
Yes, I think that's
And
true.
to anticipate the worst. And of course, those of us who have Virgo energy, and that would include me, really believe that we need to prepare for everything, not understanding that it's impossible for a person to prepare for everything, and so to trust that we have weathered or dealt with many things before, and that's where pulling from the inside is from inside you, and knowing who you are allows you to deal with and I'm not trying to prettify this, because there are lots of things in life that really truly knock us over and make us feel like we might not get up.
I agree.
However, having said that, spending all our time waiting for that moment when we're going to get knocked down and wonder if we're going to be able to get up, it affects how we live our lives on a daily basis. So as much as we are here talking about something that's 2.5 to 3 years down the road, the purpose of it is not to scare people as much as it is to help them understand what energies we're playing with. And Saturn and Pluto are pretty intense customers in their own, in different ways, and I mean, the reality is each of them can take us out in a different form.
But, yeah, and it's a valid argument, and it's a very necessary one.
So, but being aware of that, of the intensity and the energy involved in each one of them, allows us to begin to, consciousness truly is the beginning point for anything. And I know from talking with you that we both started studying astrology for approximately the same reason, whether we quantified it as such or not, and that is we were seeking awareness. We were seeking an awareness that allowed us to connect to life and to the world in a way that we had an intrinsic feeling would be satisfying to us. We had no logical or practical crumbs to follow, right? It was just, true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, that quest is good.
Well, and we all engage in the quest in a way that's meaningful to us, and that's the challenge. I guess that's why I keep on encouraging while we're talking about this for people to see, if you haven't been to see an astrologer, to seek one out. So if you really want to understand how planetary energies work in your life, and it's funny, I'm doing some major communications work for a big international astrological conference that's coming up next year in Chicago, and I was interviewing an astrologer. Her name is Becca Tarnas, and she's going to be talking about astrology as a spiritual practice.
Yeah, I've spoken with her before. I had her on the show once.
Yeah. So, we all view, and yet there are astrologers who will be looking at this conjunction we're talking about through the lens of financial astrology or through the lens of what we call mundane or political astrology. And others, this is the beauty of astrology. It allows us to, delve into all corners of life. So, we could talk about, what impact could Saturn and Pluto together have in terms of relationships and families, and, the list goes on and on and on. And, we could probably talk about this, Chris, from now until when the conjunction happens.
and then some. I think that I think the point of it is like, I think you're right. We're not here to spread fear, and there's no running for the hills, and the sky's not falling. What we need to do, we need to embrace the energy of these planets in particular, and use them. I think that we can direct them to our best purpose, is what I would say, to our highest self, whereby we strive to find something that's worthwhile. It could be a marvelous thing, And the thing is that astrology is such a rich and varied language that when we push that further, we can see how it affects so many different things. Like you mentioned, some people may look at it to astrology for financial reasons, or whether to get married, or whether to build a home or have a child. But it also brings along great moments of awareness when it comes to your own personal path. Perhaps you're supposed to be doing something you're not doing. Maybe you're sitting in a cubicle in some boring corporation someplace when you should be home throwing clay on a potter's wheel. These are the kind of things that I think people wake up to and realize that they, and I've had situations like that. I had a client once who was a lawyer, went to law school at his father's urging, and went through the thing, got the law, passed the bar, did the whole thing, and hated his job, absolutely hated it. And I remember speaking with him, and I said, wow, if I were you, I would become a potter. And he says, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I want to do. And I think I've heard from him not too long ago. That's what he's doing. So this is what the beauty of astrology is. And I think this is where we could use this Saturnian kind of energy to help focus on that. Maybe we're not missing our true purpose here.
Well, I think it's really interesting because for me, Pluto really represents, what we feel deeply passionate about, the stuff that rises from someplace inside us, which does not, always make any sense whatsoever in terms of logic, right?
Right.
Because
that's true.
and this is why Pluto's very much connected to obsession.
Yeah.
And so I always tell people that obsession isn't a bad thing. It just tells you that there's something here that requires transformation. If you can't let go of something, there's a reason for it, and it's not a bad reason. It just is. But of course, the key in this period of time might very well be say you have the Saturn Pluto conjunction is going to take place in your third house of writing. Well, maybe that would be suddenly the time that you decided I've got to sit down and I've got something I need to say. And when Pluto's involved, often it will just come pouring out. So what will the Saturn help you do? It will help you structure something that seems, at times to have a life of its own.
Yeah, I think that's very
Plutonian, right?
I think that's very accurate. Yeah, I think that's very much the case. Saturn, in this regard, I think Saturn can be your best friend. You may not enjoy it, but like you said, there's great satisfaction in accomplishing something that is difficult. Writing a book is a difficult undertaking. It takes some people 5-6 years to get a book out the door. And even then you got to deal with trying to get it published and everything else that goes with that. So indeed it is, but it is that rigor. It is the sense of rigor, I think, that Saturn imposes on us, wherever that may fall in your chart. It's that sort of, tenacity, that perseverance, that doggedness that allows us to come through that and be successful in our undertaking, which I find to be one of the most glorious things about Saturn. Oftentimes people in astrology, as I'm sure you've come across in your days in astrology, there's always been this argument that Jupiter is wonderful and Saturn is a pain in the neck. Well, I don't always think that's the case. I think that, Jupiter can be just as much of an amplifier and could actually inflame things if it's poorly aspected. And Saturn can come along to save the day. So I think you got to have a balanced approach to all of them. Yes, Jupiter is known for expansion and optimism and all that, and it can be very good, depending upon where it's placed in your chart, where it's transiting. But this can also be just the opposite. So you've always got to look at it.
It can lead to hubris.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Which means you don't think the laws of the universe apply to you.
Right.
And of course I understand why. Now, if we just think about the history of our continent in terms of the Europeans who came here, most of them came here because of difficulties of some kind or another, Saturnian difficulties, whether it had to do with faith or food or finances.
Or they were criminals. They could have been criminals, right?
Yeah, we didn't. Australia tended to be more of a repository for criminals.
Right. No, I understand.
Interesting.
I know.
So, but the reality is, so we on this continent I think sometimes tend to fight more with Saturn because our forebears were trying to escape limitations that were robbing them of whatever they thought was important, whether it was food, finances, or faith. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting what in different parts of the world they have different relationships with these planets. And the truth is, prior to allowing the outer planets, and I'm talking Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, into our consciousness, Saturn represented the final arbiter. And we are blessed to live in a part of the world where we can actually speak about how to use Saturn as a gift and a contribution, as opposed to a determinant of our future. Because, say, we were born in the Middle Ages, Saturn was very much in play. You could not rise above your station unless somebody in a position of authority gave you permission to do that.
Right. Yeah.
You were born into a particular, and we live in a time and a place where, we can daily choose to, pardon the old hippie expression, ignore the man if we want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we can't ignore it when it comes to the banks but in our personal lives, we can, like the client of yours that, did all that study to be a lawyer, hating every second of it, and then finally when, that doesn't work for me, he had a choice. We have freedom of choice. And so one of the things that we're talking about today is how can you choose to relate to these upcoming energy trends of, transits. How can you choose to work with that energy as opposed to this is what's going to happen, batten down the hatches?
Right. You need to lean into it rather than run from it. That's what I'd say. You say you use it as a fulcrum, and you lean into where the hardship is. You lean right into it. It's like wearing a wool shirt or something like that that's itchy, or a hair shirt. The old days I used to wear hair shirts that would make people very uncomfortable. It's that kind of nagging feeling that forces you to do something. If you didn't have it, I always say if the roof did not leak, we would not repair it. So when the roof is leaking, you have to repair it, right? Isn't that the truth? And so therefore we can't ignore it.
Yep.
If we're lying in bed and there's a drip, drip, drip in your head, you're not going to last that too long. So you're going to get up there and you're going to fix that roof and you're going to make sure. And I think that's what these kind of a conjunction is bringing us to a point in time where it says we've got to fix things. Now, I know you're a Canadian, but in the United States, we have a terrible problem with infrastructure. Our roads are falling down, our bridges are coming down. And these are things that need to be taken care of. We can't ignore some of these structures that were built over 100 years ago. I mean, I was reading the other day about a subway that's in New York City going back to the early 1900s. That's way overdue as far as how long are these things supposed to last? I mean, this is the time to wake up.
That's kind of scary. I wouldn't be getting on that subway.
Well, I mean, look at the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge, I think, opened up in 1899, I believe. So that's an old structure. I mean, things don't last forever, as we know. So it's interesting.
Well, it's interesting because in the city that I live in, we had this old bridge, and it had a metal decking on it, and they repaired it like a bazillion times. And finally, they just decided that perhaps they should build a new bridge.
Yeah.
Which is what they're doing. So.
And this is a very Plutonic kind of thing, it's very earthbound, Pluto and Capricorn, Saturn. It's very earthbound. It sort of deals with the infrastructure, the highways, our big systems, our big, large organizational entities, our banks, our colleges, our universities. These are all things that are feeling the duress and can use, some help.
I believe that in my country we have a slightly different approach and attitude towards those things. I think that they've just begun a new, in our country, because the weather tends to be more extreme
right.
over much of it, we cannot afford to allow things to not to be properly taken care of. And in fact, I live in a province where we probably have the best highway system in all of North America. There are so many secondary highways and roads that are paved.
Yeah, that's good. And that's a very responsible way to think about it. We are talking today, I am talking today, and we are both talking today with Lesley Francis, who is an astrologer out of Canada, was kind enough to come on today. We're talking about Saturn and Pluto conjunction, which will be happening up in 2020. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes. In the meantime, her website is lesleyfrancis.com. Check it out. It's Lesley. Francis is the last name, .com. And we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, so hang in there. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color. Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. Today we're speaking with Lesley Francis. LesleyFrancis.com is her website. She's a Canadian astrologer. I love Canada. I've always loved Canada. Matter of fact, I had my first honeymoon in Canada. Took the Trans-Canadian Railroad across that beautiful country, and I've always been in love with Canada. And who knows, the way things are going, I may end up there someday. Anyway, we are talking about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which will be coming up in the year 2020. Now, that seems... those of you who understand astrology, and I'm sure there's a lot of you that do, understand what we all know, what we think of Saturn archetypally. We know we think of Pluto archetypally. We think, wow, put those two together in a cake batter, what are we going to get for there? And we can approach that with a sense of, gosh, run for the hills, or we can approach it with a sense of, well, this is a time to really set the clock, get things back in shape, do our duty, get our roads fixed, get things back in order, and kind of reset the standard for going forward so that we are able to sustain ourselves. I do think it adds a nice forcing function that allows us to come into our own. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes I always use the analogy of a cuckoo clock when I talk about astrology, because I think that each human is comprised of all these little wheels inside of them turning at different speeds, represented by your planets and other aspects in your chart. And every once in a while, when they all line up and click just right, the bird comes out and people arrive. And I've seen this in famous people. You've seen them arrive at a certain time, and then you see them wither away, and then other people arrive at different times. And it can be a wide span of time frame. You could be 5 years old and arrive, like Michael Jackson when he's dancing on the stage, or you could be someone who doesn't get there until very late in their life. My point is that I think astrology provides us with a guide for when we need to hold and when we need to fold, using that old poker analogy. And I think that when you understand your chart succinctly and understand enough of what's going on, you can use it to really act at the time and you're supposed to act. And you'll find that you have acted at the time you're supposed to act in your life. And it's a wonderful boon to us in that regard, especially knowing that rich language and having that backdrop. You've got to be philosophic, and it's not for everybody. And granted, it is a lot of hard work. But if you reach out to an astrologer and get a good reading, you'll be amazed at the kind of information you can glean from that. But as we look at the Saturn and the Pluto together, and of course, shortly there, or around that same time frame, Jupiter will be there, which will be really quite the birthday party in that neck of the woods. Wherever that is in your life, you'll find a lot of activity there. And you may approach it looking at it today like, oh gosh, here comes the sky is falling. But then when the time comes, you're like, wow, that was a great thing that happened. I have changed my life. I've stepped into the fear. I'm not afraid. I've leaned into it, and I'm a better person. And I'm curious, how do you feel about all that, Lesley?
Well, it's interesting because a couple of things came up while you were talking. Number one is Saturn is very much connected to timing. And I often will have clients say, well, how come blah, blah, everything's lined up in appropriate places, and how come nothing's happening? I said, well, it really is a case of the right time. And we do tend to try to get ahead of ourselves in terms of process and recognize that as again, the chickens will come home to roost when it's time. We live in a world where everything has become so instant that we've forgotten, and this is where we connect to Saturn. Saturn reminds us, all in good time, all in good time, all in good time. That came up. Saturn is also reward for all your hard work. So when Saturn comes up to conjunct Pluto, depending on where that happens to be in your chart or what's going on in your life, it could be a time of huge reward for you. You could gather towards yourself all the rewards for all the hard work you've done. We tend to always, in astrology, think that reward comes through the planets that we call the benefics, right?
Right.
Venus and Jupiter, but that's not. The lasting rewards often come through Saturn.
Mm-hmm. And Mars is the great Mars is the great motivator that gets you to do that as well.
And I've been telling a lot of my clients lately that with Pluto and Capricorn, what is Pluto and Capricorn asking us of us? It's asking us to act in integrity, and and so we see a lot of things literally falling apart because they're built on a foundation that is not built on integrity. They're sitting on something that was built without consideration for long-term consequences. Because Saturn is not at all about immediate satisfaction.
No, it's
Saturn can delay gratification forever and ever and ever if it thinks that you need to, right? So this conjunction has the potential, when we talk about it, for things, and where Pluto's involved, there's always extremes. When you've got a strong Pluto, like there's two speeds, 0 and 180.
That's right.
And so, Saturn coming together with Pluto, it's the potentials are, and the possibilities are difficult at this point in time to define in terms of probabilities, unless we're talking about them in very general terms, hoping to give people some places where they can open the door and cross a threshold.
Right.
But I would, one of the things I would say is remember that, whatever information you take from the conversation that Chris and I are having is to recognize you need to find a way to access this energy in a personal way. And that means, however you choose it, you can do it through going to have your chart read, you can do it through meditation. There's all kinds of ways to get in touch with these things and to recognize that what we're trying to do is to give you a broad spectrum. It's like we're bringing out all the potential colors and you get to paint a painting. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that one of the things that I like to think of when I think of when these aspects come together is that it does represent a potential for action. And I think we, being forewarned, are forearmed in this regard, because if we know the potential is there, we know something's coming, we can harness that potential and use it to direct. That's the beauty of it. So when people think of difficult times, How did Benjamin Franklin discover lightning? He was flying a kite in the middle of a thunderstorm. For whatever reason, the idea of that is that he recognized that there was a potential there. If you don't step into the potential, you'll never know what's going on. I also think that people oftentimes get very placated by their circumstances. It's easy to be uncomfortable because uncomfortable in some ways is familiar. If you're unhappy in a relationship, if you're unhappy in a job, but you know it's predictable. You know the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So people don't take the opportunity to step out of their comfort zone. They stay in that place, and as a result, they may very well miss what is there right before them.
That's interesting because I think that is another potential of Saturn Pluto. It is a recognition that it's time to transform any limitations that you might have, and you know, because really Pluto is all about what's in the depths. You know, it really very much connects to what I like to call emotional archaeology.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I like that.
And so, but how can you make? So we often have these awarenesses, and yet, you know, they all stay in the head. You know, and we think that if we perceive something mentally, that somehow that changes everything. And Pluto is always here to remind us that the deeper changes that we seek happen at levels that we can't even quantify or sometimes even qualify. I know for myself, in the mid-90s, I was diagnosed with clinical depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. If that's not a Saturn-Pluto transit, I don't know what is.
Right. But it also prompted you to repair it.
Can I tell you how? Can I tell you how I got through that? In some ways, I can't. I just know that at some point, what galvanized me was the thought that I might never accomplish anything again in my life, and it just blew me away. And that was the starting point.
That's what I mean by potential. It's that potential that's there. Potential is it's an energy of sorts that is ready to be acted on. And because that moment and that condition came to you, you were forced to step into it like you did, as you leaned into it in order to resolve it. You accepted it, or you tried to mitigate it, or you tried to work with it. But had that not happened, you never would have been able to work through that. So it is sort of a horse and cart kind of thing where you've got to have the difficulty arrives, you rise into it, you lean into it, you try to implement change, and you come out the other side feeling as if you now know how to manage. And that's part of what I think the great challenge of life is. It's what keeps, it's what makes this great wheel turn. It really is. It is about that energy and being able to capture it and use it towards your best interest.
Well, it's funny because as you're talking, it reminds me, how many times, and you never used to hear this all the time, but now in the last 10 years, people will just across the board will say there's got to be a reason for it. And really that speaks to purpose, and really that's Saturn, and the recognition that everything in your life has a purpose. And the key is what are you going to choose to do with it, which is essentially what we're talking about here today. As we know this transit's coming up, it's got a purpose, and you can participate in sorting out and defining what the purpose of that transit's going to be in your life. Mm. And often people say, well, should we care also about the world? Well, it leads me back to the I Ching, which really teaches us that you cannot change the world unless you're prepared to change yourself. So when we begin with the personal, it does have an effect flowing outwards from ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's very valid. I mean, that makes a lot. I like the reference of the I Ching, because that is that's really where it all comes from. I mean, we can't change anything without changing ourselves, and the point I was trying to make is that people oftentimes will be in something that's familiar, as I was mentioning before, whether it be a job or a relationship, that it's familiar, and because it's familiar, there's a certain amount of predictability to it. But by the same token, if they turned the corner, if they did make the change, they did leave the relationship, they did quit the job, they may come back and say, wow, why did I wait so long to do that? That's the upside, and that's what can also be there. So when we're forced to do massive changes within our lifestyles, if people leave us or we lose our jobs or whatever, they are wake-up calls that I think help guide us to our real true purpose at some point in time. You have to look around. That's why the beauty of astrology is there, because what it can tell you is this is where you're able, this is where a perfect stranger can tell you who knows astrology. This is where your challenges are. And if they can see that so clearly, that is validating of the highest order. So I think it's really quite useful to be able to step into those things and maybe take the chance. We never know. There's an expression that says leap and the net will appear. Well, you might not want to jump out of an airplane, but you might take a chance on leaving a job because you find that you're just not satisfied, you're not getting anywhere. As that gentleman I spoke of earlier who left a very lucrative career as a lawyer, and his father was quite upset at this, and he's now throwing a lump of clay against a potter's wheel and being very happy with his life. So that shows that taking that leap it takes courage. It builds character, as you mentioned earlier, but then nonetheless, the outcome is where you want to be.
Well, it really does take me to my favorite quote of all time, which is Shakespeare's "To thine own self be true."
Yeah.
And I think that is a lifelong process. I don't think that we're always, and this is where Saturn can sometimes get us into a bit of trouble, because we're always trying to make things a little bit more finite than they actually are. The notion, how many people feel that they failed if they haven't accomplished blah, blah, blah by such and such an age. And, now we live in a time where the chances of you seeing your third Saturn return are pretty good. And so when you hit your second one, as I've had many clients do recently, I say to them, well, you know what? This is a new chapter open in your life. It's not time for you to fold your tent and sit on a rocking chair and wait for your life to end. You still have lots of get up and go, so get up and go.
Right. And that's a very good point. And I think it is about an opportunity to reinvent yourself. Oftentimes the second Saturn return is a gift. Your kids are up and grown, perhaps the house is paid off, or who knows what. But and that gives you time maybe to send more focus back to yourself and to sort of lay down those tracks for maybe starting a new way of living, embracing new philosophies, deepening your experience on Earth. And I think that people can gain a lot from self-introspection in that regard by giving to others as well. I think there's a great deal of charity that can be given that isn't necessarily being given right now. I think there's not a whole lot of charity in the world. I'm saying this is a very broad general statement, but there seems to be a lot of me going on throughout the world. And this is, as I said, is a very broad general statement and not aimed at anybody. But I think that is a underlying current. And this, this Pluto Saturn thing may allow us to think more globally, more community organized. I think that's a large place we have to go. We've become too disconnected via our devices and our, obsession with these, phones and stuff like that. I think as a result, we tend to hibernate or isolate ourselves when we really need to do just the opposite.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that we are much more aware of the length and breadth and depth of what goes on in the world, and through those devices, and yet we use the devices to ignore reality. And I think the reason we do that is because one of the other things that Saturn is very profoundly connected to is fear. Yeah. And so as we approach this particular conjunction, there is an opportunity for us to begin to look at, what are we afraid of? I mean, the reality is that life is always going to be uncertain, and all our attempts to avoid that just creates a lot of fear that then limits us and gets in the way of using all of that energy that we have, whether it's emotionally, psychically, spiritually, whatever, that gets consumed by trying to anticipate stuff, and by stuff I mean all the whatever the things are that you might be afraid of. Mm-hmm. So with the Saturn-Pluto transit coming up, maybe it's an opportunity for us to transcend or transform our fears, and to recognize that sometimes life is like really is like I get a picture of being on a skateboard, which is one of the things I'd be afraid of. Because I don't do very. I mean, I might live in Canada, but I've never really learned. I've never been much of a skater because I get cold too fast. But those wobbly things that whenever I think of fear, that's what I think of. I think of wobbly things because I'm not very courageous physically.
Yeah.
Don't be asking me to do bungee jumping or anything like that. But it is an opportunity for us to confront what we're afraid of. And often the way that we don't confront what we're afraid of or even try to process it, we just find something to distract us.
Right, and that's my concern.
Which speaks to what you were saying.
Yeah, the distraction factor is what concerns me because I think that, and that may very well be the underlying sort of conscious shift that happens to all of us, is that all of us sort of wake up collectively and say, wow, look at this, we've been looking at these things all this time, and look what's going on out here. My son is growing up, or my grandchild's growing up, and I'm missing this because I got my face in the phone. My grandson just scored a goal in the soccer game, and my head was looking at the news feed on my phone. Yeah, or hockey, whatever.
Hockey.
Yep. Of course, coming from Canada.
Hockey. No.
That's true. And but these things are. I think this could be a time for us to see that, and I think that. Even though the internet and the web and social media are wonderful tools, and I don't mean to disparage them in any way. I love what they do. You and I wouldn't be talking right now if it weren't for that. But they also bring to the foreground this ability, the tendency for us to avoid contact. When I see teenagers texting each other in the same room, that bothers me because, why not just have a conversation? Now, maybe they're saying something in secret, and once in a while it's fun. So-and-so has a crush on so-and-so. I understand all that. But at some point in time, we need to get back to community, I believe. I think we need to get back to community, and that is a byproduct of, I think the lack of it is a byproduct of where we're headed. And I think that the backlash may very well be that our devices no longer serve the function that they need to, and it forces us to come back to community. I mean, how many people actually know their neighbors? The whole idea of the church. Growing up as a kid, I grew up in a church. Was the community. We would have community suppers. We'd have coffee hour after the church and all this stuff. We'd do all these things that allowed us to connect with each other, and we knew our neighbors. We knew the guy at the store. The guy at the store knew our name. None of that happens any longer. I'm speaking broadly again, but I think it's that human element of the connection of human to human. I mean, we see dogs. Dogs are so excited to see each other. Cats are excited generally to see each other because they like, wow, another dog. So we have much of that same sort of part of our fabric as that as well. And I think that by backing away from this sense and becoming isolated, it has its benefits, yes, I would say that, but I also think there's a downside to it. And I think we have to try to be mindful of that and, reach out and be more community organized and more community oriented.
Well, I might be a little bit of a devil's advocate and ask if this doesn't symbolize, what's going on really, that what passed for connection wasn't perhaps as deep and as profound as we humans are capable of. I think that, in order to and that would also, to me, be part of the Saturn-Pluto thing, because Pluto is about taking it into the depths, and we will go a long way out of our way to avoid any intensity of experience. It's like it's the oddest thing I find sometimes, that people seek connection, but they always want it to be in control of that connection. And so so when we look at people texting each other and everything, of course they do it. They have complete control. They don't have to look at someone while they tell them what they're really thinking, and they're not worried about what the consequences are at all. I think that's the part that bothers me. Is not so much that people use those things to communicate with each other, but they don't. It's like the person that they're communicating with is just an object.
Right.
And that they have every right to say whatever they want to say to that object.
It dehumanizes each other. They dehumanize each other.
Yeah.
They become less. They become automaton.
And I think that we do. To me, this is just an extreme. I don't think it's a sudden development. I think that, well, for me, I and this is also I think as part of the Saturn-Pluto thing, is coming to recognize just how endemic abuse is to the planet, that we take a lot of the more subtle forms of abuse for granted and don't question or challenge them. And I think that we're in a space and a time where all of the things where we see people being abusive to each other, whether it's in a big way or a little way, are becoming increasingly obvious to us and disturbing us at deeper levels, because I think our basic humanity is such that we don't come here to seek that. I think we need to, I don't know, my thoughts are going like 99 miles an hour, and this is a topic that has so many threads to it, I'm not even sure which one I should follow.
Well, I think I understand I get the gist of where you're going, and I would comment that perhaps we are where we are now in order to get us to where we need to be. So this would be sort of the swinging of the pendulum. If things are this way, if they are fractious, if we have this lot of hate crimes and fake news or whatever, we see this stuff happening, that is a wake-up call to shift to nudge the pendulum back in the other direction. So this, in some ways, is part of the ebb and flow, the yin and yang, the plus and minus of life. And I think that it's, even though it's unpleasant to go through it, which gets us back to our initial subject, these unpleasantries may be forcing functions that get us to a better spot. It's the hard work to get us to that spot.
Well, it's funny because I really do. This forms quite a foundation of where I come from in the work that I do, and that is, I know people often talk about soul evolution.
Right.
I really think it's humans that require evolution. The human condition requires a serious amount of evolution. I once said to someone, I don't think we need a political revolution. I think we need a spiritual evolution.
Right. I think that's totally accurate. And I don't think that we see that in Western society as much as we do in other parts of the world where they are more evolved in some regard. Our priorities are shifted. We are much different in that regard.
Well, yes, but it could also be argued that in the parts of the world where there's more of a balance between inner and outer, there are still gross inequities in their world as well. So we humans are, and that's when you come to realize that we are here to experience duality in all of its various and sundry forms, and a lot of the dualities are more than unpleasant. They're deeply disturbing and difficult, especially if you happen to be sensitive, and that is a challenge. And when you open up your awareness and you begin to realize that there are more frequencies than just the third dimension, there are there's sensing, there's feeling, there's all those things that we can't quantify. Although I have to say that I believe that astrology does a very powerful job of helping people understand exactly how to access, because for me the Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune coming into our awareness was all about opening up our consciousness.
Yes, it was. Yeah, for sure.
So that we could begin to not so much transcend the physical, but transform the physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah, and I like that concept. I always have subscribed to that. I think we are at that point in time where, and that's why I think that this could be the great lesson of this Saturn Pluto conjunction. Could be this sort of resetting the standard. We have sort of gone way off the track and way off a kilter with regard to how we are treating each other in some parts of the world, and gone way off track and off, out of line there. I think this may be a chance to reset that. And as I said, of course, it's the applying pressure that when we feel it, once the conjunction happens, it begins to diminish a bit and we feel less of it. But I think that the important piece of it will be this moving forward through a hardship. Like you say, it builds character. I totally agree with you on that one. And in that hardship, we find that there is there's the cherry at the end of the tunnel. The prize is at the end of the tunnel, I think. But we've got to get through it first. So we have been
speaking. How long is the tunnel?
Good question. I'll get back to you on that one. No, it's a long tunnel. It's a long tunnel, and I know it's a good question. It reminds me when I was taking the Trans-Canadian Railroad across. As we were leaving out of Calgary, going up into the Rockies, and there's this one tunnel, in the middle of the Rockies, which is a fascinating time. And you enter, the train enters in, and it goes into this gigantic corkscrew tunnel, which lasts about 45 minutes underground inside the middle of this mountain. The train is going very slowly. It's pitch black. You're inside this tunnel, going on this long, slow, gradual corkscrew that brings you out down below, down closer to sea level, because trains can only go on such a certain amount of grade, up or down. And it's remarkable, and that's kind of what it feels like. This is a long tunnel we're going through, going around in the dark, not quite clear where we are, but we're soon going to come out, and things may be better at the other end. So there we go.
Now, if that's not a Plutonian experience, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it certainly is.
In the dark, in a mountain, underground.
Going in a circle. Even better. Anyway, we've been talking today with Lesley Francis. She's an astrologer out of Canada, out of Alberta, Canada, up that way, up the North Country. And her website is lesliefrancis.com. It's Lesley, Francis.com. I encourage you to go there. She's going to be involved in many of the in the upcoming UAC, which is the United Astrological Conference, happening in May of 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And I look forward to seeing you, because I'm planning on going to that same conference myself, and
Awesome.
we'll have to have a good catch up when we see each other. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on today, Lesley. It's been great talking to you. And again, LesleyFrancis.com is her website. Lesley Francis, out of Canada. Very wise and erudite woman who knows her astrology. Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Lesley.
Chris.
You're very welcome. Take care. You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.